Hello there. Ever tried buying concert tickets just an hour after they go on sale, only to find that they're completely sold out? Happens all the time. In fact, it makes the news regularly. Now, that might not surprise you, maybe you've come to expect it, but from an economic point of view, it's actually kind of strange. The tickets vanish in minutes, and slower fans end up paying sky-high prices to scalpers. Wouldn't it make more sense for artists to just raise ticket prices in the first place? That way, the extra money goes to them, not the resellers, and that's exactly what the standard supply and demand model would predict. But we all know that's not what happens in the real world, so why not? Why do we see underpriced tickets and explosive demand time and time again? Well, it turns out there's fascinating work by Nobel laureate Gary Becker that helps explain exactly this. But to understand it, let's first take a look at how the basic supply and demand model works. We start with a simple graph with quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. Onto this, we add a demand curve, which simply represents how much quantity of a good will be demanded from the public at any given price point. It's typically downward sloping, which simply represents the fact that as items get more expensive, they become a bit less attractive to buy. On the sell side of the equation, we have what's called the supply curve, which in contrast to the demand curve is typically upward sloping. This simply represents the fact that as an item gets more expensive, it's much more attractive to produce and sell it. These are all the components of the basic supply and demand model, but to better understand how it functions, we should illustrate it with a small example. It's probably easiest to do this with a market where everyone can participate, so let's imagine for a second we're in the business of buying and selling pictures of our feet. Anyone can become a supplier by simply taking out their phone, aiming it downwards and snapping a picture of their bare feet. And similarly, finding a platform to buy them online shouldn't be a problem for most people nowadays. But now let's say the price for feet pics is currently quite low. Now, in this situation, you have a lot of people willing to buy pictures, but very few people willing to sell their dignity so cheaply. This results in excess demand and what in economics we would generally call a shortage. What happens in such situations is that as time goes on, buyers become increasingly desperate and are willing to pay higher prices, and as prices get higher, suppliers are willing to provide the goods. This process, by which the supply and the demand equate, is also called market clearing. Well, now we understand the classic supply and demand model, but feet pictures and concert tickets are very different kinds of goods. While for feet pictures, it's trivially easy to expand the supply, for concert tickets, once the venue is booked, the artist can do little to nothing to extend the seat capacity. We can accommodate this easy enough in our model. If we just straighten out and rotate the supply curve, we get what is called an inelastic supply. In this case, inelastic simply means that the amount of seats provided does not respond to price at all. As you can see, for this example, the model still works perfectly normal. We have a clear point of intersection, and setting the price any lower will lead to excess demand that we cannot fulfill. Setting the price any higher will lead to empty seats in our concert, neither of which is optimal for an artist looking to maximize their revenue. But the model only gets really interesting once we introduce something called social demand. Up until now, our demand function was solely determined by the price level, but the concept of social demand introduces another element into this equation, namely aggregate demand. What this means for our example is that people are more willing to pay for the ticket if there are many other people demanding a ticket as well. This could be due to many different reasons. It could be FOMO, or the rush of being in line or at the event with many other excited people, or simply the exclusivity of being the one who managed to snatch a ticket while others didn't. However, this is something very strange to our demand function, which is now, at least for parts of it, upward sloping. Intuitively, a higher price now has two roles. Firstly, it makes the tickets less attractive, which is the same as before. But importantly, it now also serves as a signal for higher aggregate demand, which the consumers in our model care about. The latter of these effects leads our demand curve to slope upwards before the prices become steep enough to turn consumers away again. The point at which demand intersects with supply, let's call it P star, is still the market clearing price, and at that point, there is no shortage. In the standard model discussed before, raising prices higher than the market clearing price led to a fall in demand and thus a lower quantity of items sold. However, in this situation, something interesting happens. Because here a high price is a signal for high aggregate demand, raising the price actually makes the event more attractive. This causes an increase in demand, and because the supply is fixed, it leads to a shortage. So in this model, the optimal choice for the seller is actually to increase the price past the point of market clearing to P max. However, our artists in this situation will have to be really careful not to set their prices too high, because at any point beyond Pmax, there will be no demand at all. Such a sharp drop-off is really quite a counterintuitive result and not at all in line with what we expect from any other supply and demand situation. Perhaps a simple way to visualize this is to treat it as some sort of doom spiral. At some point, the price is simply so high that most people deem it unaffordable. At that point, the implication is that aggregate demand will be low, and this in our model makes the entire event less appealing. In a more realistic scenario, people would of course measure the aggregate demand by a variety of variables, but in this very simplistic model, let's just assume they only use price for this. So this provides a pretty neat answer to the question of why does the artist not simply raise the ticket prices? And it is that they can't. Doing so would actually reduce their revenue. However, as you can probably tell, this is still a bit of an unrealistic way to think of a concert. It's hard to imagine that a popular artist like Taylor Swift would be unable to fill the stadium if she were to halve her ticket prices, for example. So, what happens if we modify the shape of this curve just a little bit more? In this case, let's have our demand curve take a little bit more of a wave shape. This shape is much more realistic because, in contrast to the old model, there is still a low price point, let's call it Pmin, at which our event is reasonably popular. However, once again, the interesting scenario is the one in which we set a high price point, as in this one there will be two equilibria. The one on the right side, where the artist manages to sell all the tickets and still creates a significant excess demand, and the one on the left side, where the event totally flops and the artist doesn't even manage to fill all the seats. In our simple model, the artists really can't do anything except set prices, so once they've set their price, it is essentially random in which of the two equilibriums they'll end up. However, in the real world, there's additional avenues for artists to take to influence the aggregate demand, or at least the perception of it, like marketing campaigns, for example. But the underlying issue remains the same. In the good equilibrium, demand is very fickle, so the artist has to be very careful not to set prices so high that most people can't afford it anymore. So, to summarize once again, the fact that you can't get a ticket to your favorite artist show is very much a feature and not a bug. Artists and event organizers are not acting stupidly or irrationally and leaving money on the table by pricing tickets too low, but instead they're simply optimizing for a highly unusual demand function. So perhaps the last thing to address is, why doesn't the artist simply expand capacity? Because there is significant space between the right equilibrium of Pmax and our inelastic supply line, that means there should be a lot of money to be made by selling even more tickets at this higher price. Well, the answer is that it's simply risky and expensive to do so. The artist has to book the venue beforehand, and the risk of ending in the bad equilibrium is quite significant. Because, as our model implies, it's often the case that concerts simply flop and only sell a fraction of the available tickets. So, I think this is a pretty cool paper, and I hope it helped you understand why tickets are priced the way they are a little bit better. I should add that concert tickets are far from the only good for which this is applicable. There are plenty of other examples, such as trendy restaurants or cafes, Labubu dolls, matcha teas, up-and-coming social media, Supreme t-shirts, or any other fashion trend really. Of course, I've simplified some things to try and make the topic more understandable, but if you're interested in the details, check out the video description. There I put a link to a small write-up on the topic, and of course to the original paper if you're interested in that. Of course, if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments. I'm always happy to talk about this topic. And yeah, that's all. Cheers.